Craig Mokhiber is an international human rights lawyer, analyst, writer, activist, former senior United States official, and a member of the Gaza People's Tribunal. He left the UN in October of 2023, penning a widely read letter that warned of genocide in Gaza, criticized the international response, and called for a new approach to Palestine based on equality, human rights, and international law. And we have posted the link to that letter in the chat. Craig has spent 4 decades in the international human rights movement, including more than 30 years at the United Nations. At the UN, he was the director of the Human Rights Office at UN headquarters in New York, held senior UN positions in Geneva, New York, and in the field, served as the senior human rights advisor in Palestine and in Afghanistan, was chief of staff of the high-level mission on Darfur, and carried out human rights missions to dozens of countries across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. Craig, with great respect, we welcome you to Middle East Peace Now. It's up to you.
Thank you so much, Janet. Great to be with you. Thanks to Middle East Peace Now for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. Janet, if I end up droning on too long, please feel free to let me know that time is short so that we can make sure we have a very big chunk of time reserved for the Q&A and for the discussion, which will be.
I will do that. That is my job.
Very good. Very good. I trust you to do that. Thank you. Well, I've been asked to talk a little bit about how the international system has been reacting to or not reacting, in some cases, to the horrors that have been unfolding in Palestine and in the broader Western Asia region, how the so-called Israel exception has played out in all of that, and how the United Nations has and could react and respond to what it is that we're seeing here. Because, I have observed before that what we're seeing now is just not only an assault on the people of Palestine and Lebanon and Iran and beyond, not only an assault on those who are speaking out against the crimes of the Israeli regime in the United States and the UK and Germany and beyond, but it is a direct assault as well on the very idea of international law, the very international system that was built up over 80 years since the Second World War. And all of this in the name of a single oppressive foreign regime known as Israel. Take the UN, for example. Throughout the genocide, senior United Nations officials have adopted a kind of rhetorical shield that allows them to avoid taking a principled stand on the genocide in Palestine. They'll say things like, only a court can determine genocide. But this, I can tell you, is a calculated dodge, because they fear a backlash from the perpetrator country, from its powerful allies, especially the US, and from very abusive Israel proxy organizations operating across the West and around the world. Only a court can decide, can be claimed about any crime. And yet they never hesitate to comment on other crimes that are being perpetrated, just this one and only with regard to the Israeli regime. For example, they regularly invoke the word terrorism without the need for a judicial decision. Furthermore, the Organization of the United Nations has obligations of genocide prevention, which is a logical impossibility after the crime has already occurred and a court has concluded its proceedings. So this really has been the diplomacy of fear. And that has been the dominant response of the political corridors of the UN to the genocide in Palestine and to aggression across the region. But such moral abdication in the case of Palestine is not new at the UN. Indeed, the coincidence in 1948 of the adoption of both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, and the horror of the Nakba that same year, was more than just a historical contradiction. It was also the birth of a virus, the virus of the Israel exception to international law, that has haunted the UN for decades, buttressed Israeli impunity, carved out space for genocide, and in the process eroded the very legitimacy and, I think, sustainability of the UN itself. So today, Palestine sits directly on a fault line between those who believe the global order should be determined by deference to power, great power politics, aggression, colonialism, and imperialism, and those who are demanding the building of a reliable international system constructed on international cooperation, human rights, equality, self-determination, and the rule of law. The genocide in Palestine has revealed the tendency, which is hardwired into the system from the start, to compromise the mandates and principles of the UN in deference to state power. But this genocide has also underscored that there are, in fact, two United Nations. The first is the UN of the Charter Norms, which is constitutionally grounded in a mission of human rights and peace and development and international law. That's the UN of the human rights treaties, of the independent human rights monitors, of the International Court of Justice. It's the UN in which the use of force is prohibited in all but a few narrowly defined circumstances. It is the UN of decolonization, the UN in which all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and in which peoples have the right to self-determination. It is the UN in which colonialism and apartheid and gross violations of human rights and genocide are absolutely prohibited. The UN that once officially recognized that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, and it is the UN in which officials rang the genocide alarm bells as far back as October of 2023. But there is another UN, a darker UN, a UN that permitted the colonization of Palestine, partitioned the land against the will of the indigenous people, ratified the ethnic cleansing of Palestine by recognizing Israel in 1948, and that tolerated decades of apartheid in Israel and the occupied territories. It is the UN that suspended the application of international law for 3 decades in favor of a disingenuous political process called Oslo, under which the Palestinians were told that they are unprotected by international law and they must negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that the mediator for the process would be the world's sole superpower and Israel's closest ally. And it is the UN that has remained almost entirely silent as genocide has raged across the land, trepidatiously avoiding any reference to the crime or to its root causes. The UN that was unable to even order a ceasefire or to hold to account the perpetrators openly committing genocide. The UN of moral failure. As the genocide in Palestine has shown, the veto power of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the only UN body with formal enforcement power, is the most obvious example of failure by design. That power has been used throughout the genocide by the United States to prevent any meaningful act of protection for Palestinian civilians, enforcement of international law, or accountability for Israeli perpetrators. 7 now successive vetoes have been exercised by the US since October of 2023, bringing US vetoes to protect Israeli impunity to a total of 50. No sanctions have been imposed by the Security Council on the perpetrator regime. No protection has been mobilized. No judicial decisions have been enforced. And the Israeli regime even remains a full member of the United Nations with full privileges, despite its perpetration of an ongoing genocide, its apartheid status, its denial of the self-determination of the Palestinian people, serial acts of aggression against its neighbors, the unlawful occupation of the territory of 3 surrounding nations, a transnational terrorist attack with booby-trap pagers, numerous assassinations, and frequent attacks on the United Nations itself, its staff, and its facilities. For its part, the UN General Assembly has adopted important resolutions to respond to the genocide in the face of a captured and moribund Security Council. And the Assembly has declared that all countries must comply with the detailed findings of the International Court of Justice on the situation. The Assembly has adopted resolutions demanding a ceasefire, and most significantly, it adopted a resolution in September of 2024 endorsing the entirety of the findings of the International Court of Justice in its historic advisory opinion of 19 July 2024, as well as the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice on Israeli genocide. And historically, in 2024, the General Assembly set a 1-year deadline for full Israeli compliance. But that deadline expired last year without any meaningful action. Instead, Israel's friends in the UN rallied to forestall any meaningful action for accountability and redress, instead creating a strategy of distraction by adopting the so-called French-Saudi proposal, now named the New York Declaration, which made no mention of genocide or of apartheid, which diverted attention away from human rights accountability under international law and again into a loose political process and the promise of a possible limited Palestinian state somewhere in the future. A plan that would deploy a proxy occupation force, further denying Palestinian agency and self-determination, that would compel Palestinians once again to negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, and that would work to normalize the Israeli regime as it consolidates its conquest of Palestine. In sum, the true focus of these initiatives was not on saving Palestine, but rather on saving Israel and the project of political Zionism, even during a genocide. That is the United Nations of complicity. As we speak, Security Council diplomats have been working for months to try to merge that plan with the very lawless Donald Trump atrocious 20-point colonial dictates for Palestine in an attempt to legitimize it with a stamp of UN approval. And so on the UN's watch, Israeli impunity continues just as Palestinian subjugation continues. Even as the horror drags on and Israel shatters record after record for civilian bloodletting, the UN General Assembly has yet to use the full range of powers at its disposal. It continues to recognize Israel's credentials, and the regime's voting rights remain intact. Even as it attacks and smears the organization, blocks its operations, raids and demolishes its installations, and abducts, detains, tortures, and murders its staff. The UN General Assembly has yet to reactivate the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms, has established no tribunal for accountability, has not moved under the Uniting for Peace mechanism to mandate a UN protection force to protect Palestinians from a genocidal regime bent on their destruction. It has not solidified earlier calls for sanctions, a military embargo, and measures to isolate the Israeli regime and to hold its officials to account. For its part, Switzerland, acting as the depositary of the Fourth Geneva Convention, scandalously last year declined to convene the Conference of High Contracting Parties requested by the General Assembly, owing to objections from Israel, the US, and their allies. This was a true scandal in international law. And this is despite the fact that the meeting of the High Contracting Parties was requested by an overwhelming number of UN member states in the General Assembly. And beyond intergovernmental bodies, the tendency to compromise UN principles in deference to power, especially the power of the US and its Western allies, has been evident in the positioning of the UN Secretary General and senior UN political officials, where the Israel exception has been in plain view. Throughout the genocide, the UN's senior-most leadership, including the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and even the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, have remained unable or unwilling to directly address the genocide or even to utter the word, instead taking refuge behind the safe language of armed conflict, the amorphous promise of a two-state solution someday, and the necessity of humanitarian aid. They've adopted a kind of both-sidesism, which fails to recognize the true dynamics of colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, oppressor and oppressed, genocidaire and victims. And barely a whisper has been heard about accountability for Israeli perpetrators. As such, the significant reserve of moral and political power of the senior-most podiums of the organization have been largely untapped. Root causes, normally the first area of inquiry in conflict resolution, have been almost entirely ignored. The seizure of Palestine in 1948, its colonization, the theft of land and homes within the Green Line, the ethno-nationalist state, the violent supremacism of Zionism, the system of apartheid, systemic inequalities, official racism and dehumanization, the plight of generations of Palestinian refugees, colonial domination, none of these have received any significant attention in the statements of the political leadership or in the succession of failed political processes launched since Oslo. Perhaps worse, the political offices operating under the direct authority of the Secretary General have not only largely ignored the genocide in Palestine, but in some cases, under external, principally Western political pressure, and without exercising the most basic levels of due diligence, have non-critically reinforced the Israeli regime's fabricated propaganda for genocide and its justifications for international crimes. Month after month, as the genocide raged and human rights monitors repeatedly rang the genocide alarm bell, the Secretary General's special advisor on the prevention of genocide remained entirely silent on the carnage in Gaza, prompting petitions from UN staff and civil society calling for her firing. The Secretary General's special advisor on sexual violence in conflict, under an organized pressure campaign from the Israeli regime and its proxy organizations in the West, refused to debunk and at times reinforced Israel's entirely fabricated accusations of a Hamas campaign of mass rape that never took place, and in doing so contributed to the regime's false narratives designed to manufacture consent for genocide. And the Office of the Special Advisor on Children in Armed Conflict, under political pressure from and through the Secretary General, repeatedly censored its annual listing of countries systematically violating the rights of children to remove Israel and to ensure its continued impunity. This is the UN of failure. But I want to point out 3 points of light in the international system. In sharp contrast to the historic failings of these intergovernmental bodies and political offices of the Secretary General, the independent human rights mechanisms mandated by the Human Rights Council in Geneva have maintained a principled, law-based approach to their human rights monitoring and reporting duties for Palestine. An especially important role has been played by Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who, in the face of a sustained campaign of harassment, smears, death threats, and slander campaigns by the governments of Israel, its allies and proxies, as well as official United States sanctions, Rapporteur Albanese has been undeterred, producing a series of meticulously documented analytical reports on the genocide and its colonial roots, maintaining a continuous visible media presence and close collaboration with Palestinian and global civil society. And several other thematic rapporteurs, as well as the UN Commission of Inquiry, have also worked diligently to defend the human rights of the Palestinian people, to build the case for Israeli accountability, to ring the genocide alarm bell, despite efforts to discredit or silence them. Throughout the genocide, the contrast between the principled, fact-based, law-centered, and accountability-focused approach of the UN human rights mechanisms on the one hand, and the equivocal, politicized, lawless, and trepidatious rhetoric of the Secretariat on the other could not be starker. And of course, the International Court of Justice is also a part of the United Nations system. Thanks to the court, the Israeli regime is today on trial for genocide. The court has issued several rounds of provisional measures and historic advisory opinions finding apartheid and racial segregation, and has held that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is entirely unlawful. And it found that the regime's obstruction of aid, attacks on UNRWA, and the use of starvation as a method of war are obvious breaches of international legal obligations. These pronouncements provide even more proof of the legitimacy of the Palestinian case and of the illegitimacy of Israel's project and its crimes in Palestine. The UN also includes courageous humanitarian workers from a host of agencies, foremost among them the people of UNRWA, who to this day continue to operate in the depths of Gaza's hell to support the survivors of the genocide, despite the smears of the Israeli regime and its collaborators in Washington and Europe, despite the bombs and the bullets and the widespread destruction, the targeting of UN facilities, the abduction and torture of countless UNRWA staff, and the murder of more than 370 of them, many along with their families. They represent the best of the UN system. They embody its highest principles. They too are a part of UN, and they deserve our solidarity. Well, then, of course, you have the reality of the member states of the UN. What have countries been doing to respond to this first ever live-streamed genocide? Well, in the wake of more than 2 years of the globally broadcast extermination of the people of Palestine, 3 distinct tracks in the international response emerged among the 193 member states of the UN. One was grounded in justice, in international law, in human rights, and in accountability. But the 2 others are dedicated to impunity, to the continued subjugation of the victims, and to the normalization of the perpetrator regime. In the diplomatic struggle that has ensued, the justice track has been under sustained attack, and those of impunity, subjugation, and violence have so far prevailed. Left to their devices, most states, the directly complicit and the timid alike, will undoubtedly take the easy way out, opting for impunity and normalization. But there's a growing people's movement across the globe that is mobilized to demand justice. Now, if you think about the context in which these states are reacting or not reacting, it makes their action all the more scandalous. We know that the roots of genocide in Palestine run deep through a century of racist colonization, the Nakba of 1947 to 48, 8 decades of apartheid, 58 years of brutal occupation, and generations of persecution. Now, for over 2 years, the world has watched in horror as the Israeli regime planned, announced, perpetrated, and celebrated the accelerated genocide of the Palestinian people. Adding to the horror of this historic atrocity has been the ruthless complicity of so many governments, media corporations, weapons and tech manufacturers, Israel proxy groups planted among the populations of the West. The unprecedented nature of this genocide has been driven home by so many terrifying firsts. The first live stream genocide, witnessed by millions around the world. The first high-tech genocide, perpetrated with state-of-the-art weapon systems, killer drones, autonomous weapons, surveillance technologies, and artificial intelligence. And the first globalized genocide, perpetrated with the direct and enthusiastic participation of so many governments, foremost among them the governments of the US, the UK, and Germany, and the active complicity of so many corporations and organizations around the globe. And Zionist repression has extended far beyond the shores of Palestine, overflowing to Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Iran, the Mediterranean Sea, and beyond. Here in the West, complicit Western institutions have been using state power to oppress and silence all who dare to speak out against the genocide and their government's complicity in it. At the same time, in just over 2 years, the Israeli regime has shattered record after bloody record for the murder of several categories of protected persons, including medical personnel, journalists, aid workers, UN staff, and children, as well as one of the highest civilian casualty rates ever recorded. And it has achieved the dubious distinction of creating the widest global consensus in real time on the perpetration of the crime of genocide ever recorded. With declarations of genocide issued by the UN's Commission of Inquiry, its independent human rights rapporteurs, leading human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, leading Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations, the leading association of genocide scholars and international lawyers around the world. This is quintessential genocide. Its genocidal intent declared out loud by Israeli leaders from the start, followed by a horrific catalog of genocidal acts carried out with a violence as ruthless as it is systematic. Neighborhood after neighborhood, town after town, hospital after hospital, school after school, shelter after shelter, church after church, mosque after mosque, agricultural field after field, food store after food store. 2.5 years of siege, blocking aid, food, water, medicine, fuel, every essential of human rights. A chain of massacres, mass abductions, torture camps, sexual violence, intentionally imposed disease and starvation. Palestinian toddlers shot by snipers for sport. Palestinian captives tortured to death. Gaza reduced to a moonscape, and the bloodshed spreading across the West Bank. But so blatant were the crimes of the Israeli regime and its US partners that within months of the launch of its genocidal onslaught, the Israeli regime was on trial for genocide at the World Court, the International Court of Justice, and its leaders were indicted for crimes against humanity at the International Criminal Court. This was the beginning of the justice track. Experts had sounded the genocide alarm bell already in October of 2023, and since then, human rights monitors have collected volumes of evidence, even as complicit states work to buttress the impunity of the Israeli regime. The global public demand for accountability has grown louder and louder. That would ultimately compel the government of South Africa to bring its historic ICJ case against the regime under the United Nations Genocide Convention in December of 2023. The court found that the allegations of genocide are plausible in January of 2024 and issue what would be the first of a series of provisional measures binding on the Israeli regime. And months later, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for the regime's infamous prime minister and defense minister for crimes against humanity. Then in July of 2024, the ICJ issued a landmark advisory opinion concluding that Israel was committing apartheid and racial segregation, that all of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza are unlawfully occupied, that Israel must remove all settlements, settlers, soldiers, and occupation infrastructure. It must dismantle the apartheid wall in the West Bank, provide reparations to the Palestinians, and allow all those forced to leave to return home. The court said that all other states have a legal obligation not to recognize or assist the occupation and are obliged to help to bring an end to Israel's occupation and its other violations of international law. And it found that all states must end all treaty relations with Israel that relate to the territories, that they must cease all economic trade and investment relations with the regime that are connected to its occupation. Importantly, the court, and very historically also, rejected arguments by the US and other Western governments that sought to claim that the court should defer to the Oslo-style negotiations between occupier and occupied, and to the politics of the Security Council rather than to the application of international law. The court, in rejecting these claims entirely, declared that such negotiations and agreements do not and cannot trump the rights of the Palestinians and the obligations of the Israeli regime under international human rights and humanitarian law. The court found first that in any event, the parties have to exercise any powers and responsibilities under any agreements with due regard for the norms and principles of international law. Invoking Article 47 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the court then put the matter to rest for good, reminding states that as a matter of law, the protected population, quote, shall not be deprived of the benefits of the conventions by any agreement concluded between the parties of the occupied territories and the occupying power. For this reason, the court continued, the Oslo Accords cannot be understood to detract from Israel's obligations under the rules of international law applicable in the occupied Palestinian territory. With the bang of a gavel, the court ended decades of Israeli legal exceptionalism and launched a process for the dismantling of the Western-constructed Israeli wall of impunity. In the meantime, at the United Nations, international human rights investigators were issuing their own findings of Israeli regime apartheid and genocide. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights issued a series of powerful reports documenting these crimes. These were followed by further reports from thematic rapporteurs, and ultimately the UN Commission of Inquiry finding genocide in Palestine. Outside the UN, international human rights organizations, as well as those in Palestine and Israel, joined the global consensus, as did prominent international lawyers, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, sealing the consensus on the genocide in Palestine. And then thereafter, the findings of these judicial and expert bodies of the international system finally broke through to the political bodies of the UN. And in September of 2024, the UN General Assembly adopted a dramatic resolution, effectively codifying all of the findings of the International Court of Justice, declaring the occupation entirely unlawful, demanding an end to the entire occupation and the assault on Gaza, and setting a one-year deadline for Israeli compliance, after which the General Assembly promised further measures. For the first time in decades, the stage was set for real Israel regime accountability. Global civil society activists, led by representatives of Palestinian civil society, seized on this unprecedented opportunity of the one-year deadline, which was entirely violated by the Israelis ultimately, but to formulate an agenda for Israeli accountability and Palestinian protection. They developed a plan for adoption in the General Assembly at the end of the deadline that would use the extraordinary powers of the Assembly under the Uniting for Peace process to circumvent the US veto in the Security Council and to mandate concrete measures for accountability and protection. This would call a UN General Assembly call for sanctions, a military embargo, the rejection of the credentials of the Israeli regime, the establishment of a criminal tribunal, the reactivation of the UN's anti-apartheid mechanisms, and the mandating of a UN protection force to protect civilians, ensure humanitarian aid, preserve evidence of Israeli crimes, and facilitate reconstruction. And very importantly, that protection force was to be mandated on the basis of Palestinian consent, not on the basis of Chapter 7 that would allow it to impose itself against the will of the indigenous Palestinian people, thus obviating fears of a proxy occupation. That initiative was subsequently embraced by Colombian President Gustavo Petro, who in his speech before the 80th session of the General Assembly promised to introduce the proposal as a draft resolution was being prepared and diplomatic action proceeded to secure co-sponsors. Within days of doing so, President Petro was sanctioned and attacked by the United States government. In the meantime, the unprecedented possibility of Israeli accountability that was bubbling up in the justice track and was presented by the General Assembly resolution and its deadline, all of these developments were not lost on Israel's allies either. Israel's allies started to work feverishly to forestall any possibility of accountability coming into force. This was the second track, the so-called French-Saudi track. And the tactics that they adopted have become all too familiar during the decades of Oslo. Divert attention away from accountability in international law. Move attention into a loose political process and a promise of maybe some kind of Palestinian state or Bantustan at some point in the future. Compel Palestinians to negotiate for their rights with their oppressors and work to normalize the Israeli regime as it consolidates its conquest of Palestine. In sum, the true focus of these initiatives was not on enforcing international law or saving Palestine in the middle of a genocide, but rather on saving Israel and the project of Zionism in Western Asia. French President Emmanuel Macron made his intentions and the intentions of this initiative clear in a letter that he wrote to Israel regime counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu in September of 2025. In that letter, Macron openly brags about his efforts in France to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism in order to punish dissent to his pro-Israel rule. And then he tells Netanyahu that his actions at the UN, including recognizing an unarmed Palestinian Bantustan, are meant, quote, to transform the military gains that Israel has achieved on regional fronts into a lasting political victory for Israel, to the benefit of Israel's security and prosperity, to secure Israel's full regional integration in the Middle East, its normalization, and an end to Hamas. In other words, the French-Saudi proposal was not about holding the Israeli regime accountable for genocide and aggression in the region, but rather to shore up the Zionist project in Western Asia, to consolidate its violent and unlawful gains, and to normalize it on the international stage while it was perpetrating a genocide. The final product of the French-Saudi proposal was the so-called New York Declaration, which was endorsed by the UN General Assembly in September of 2025, just 8 days before the General Assembly deadline to hold Israel accountable was set to expire. The declaration mentioned neither the genocide nor the crime of apartheid. It contained no accountability measures for the Israeli regime whatsoever. It was, in effect, a last-minute defensive maneuver to preserve the wall of Israeli impunity that the West had so carefully built up over the prior 8 decades. In essence, the declaration read like a blueprint for the further entrenching of the unjust status quo that existed before October of 2023, but with extra rewards for Israel and an amorphous promise of a possible limited Palestinian Bantustan somewhere down the road. Indeed, it promised to advance normalization and regional cooperation for the genocidal Israeli regime in the fields of trade and infrastructure, energy, and security. Ignoring justice and accountability altogether, it instead dedicated itself to peace, security, and stability in the middle of a genocide. It reduced the genocide in Gaza to an armed conflict in which both sides are at fault. And it declared yet another political process toward a two-state solution as the only way forward. It ignored the role of the U.S. as a co-perpetrator in the genocide and explicitly supported the role of the U.S. as a mediator in the process, even though it was one of the perpetrators. And while it demanded that Hamas free all Israeli captives and only provided for the exchange of some Palestinian captives, and in flagrant disregard for the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, it purported to impose its own governance framework on the Palestinian people, with the Palestinian Authority to be involved. and Hamas to be excluded from government in Gaza. Eventual elections would only be open to those committed to respect the Palestinian Authority platform, Palestinian resistance groups that had defended their land and people against occupation, apartheid, and genocide were to be disarmed and excluded, while the Israeli perpetrator regime that perpetrated the genocide faced no such disarmament. And any eventual Palestinian state was envisaged to be disarmed and defenseless. In other words, in other provisions, the plan would promote so-called de-radicalization, a very dangerous concept born in the so-called war on terrorism, in which populations are subjected to propaganda programs and punitive measures designed to discourage resistance to foreign domination and abusive regimes, despite the fact that such resistance is a right under international law. It also proposed the deployment of troops under a so-called stabilization force to the region as a kind of proxy occupation. The mandate of the mission would include some civilian protection functions, but it would transfer internal security responsibilities to the Palestinian Authority, would disarm all other factions, provide border security on behalf of the Israeli regime. And remember, the hyper-armed, nuclear-capable, and thoroughly militarized Israeli regime was going to be protected rather than the people who had been subjected to genocide, as it kept an eye on resistance as well. And then was the third track, right? This is the Trump track. Following up on his earlier King Leopold-esque promise to own Gaza. You know, King Leopold was the colonial ruler in Belgium who owned the Congo as his personal property and all of the people who lived there. This is the model upon which the Trump plan has been based, in which he has declared that he will own Gaza and build a colonized Riviera on the bones of its genocided population. Trump announced his 20-point plan at the end of September of last year. And this was the third, and from a human rights perspective, the most destructive track of all. In this long-standing tradition of Western imperial arrogance in Palestine, dating back to Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, Trump's 20 points were not negotiated with the Palestinians before he issued them. Indeed, Palestinians were not consulted or involved in their drafting. Rather, in a blatant 21st century gunboat diplomacy, they were presented as a unilateral dictate from the U.S.-Israel axis, accompanied by violent threats of total destruction if they were not accepted. The document was the product of an international rogues gallery of characters, which, in addition to the genocide complicit Trump and the ICC indicted fugitive Netanyahu, included notorious figures like Iraq war criminal Tony Blair and Trump's Zionist billionaire son-in-law and family friend of Netanyahu, Jared Kushner. They did consult some of its complicit Arab and Muslim allies, but even they subsequently complained that the document was changed in fundamental ways by Trump and Netanyahu after they reviewed it. Netanyahu was allowed to make last-minute changes to the text before it was issued, and then stood with Trump to say that he agreed to it. And then within hours, Netanyahu was publicly renouncing elements of the plan and pledging that there would never be a Palestinian state and that Israeli soldiers would not leave Gaza. To be clear, this was not a peace plan or a plan for ending the Israel-Palestine conflict, so-called. It provided no promise of Palestinian liberation, no restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people, no guarantee of Palestinian statehood and self-determination. Instead, a vague and qualified reference to, quote, conditions that, quote, may emerge sometime in the future if Gaza redevelopment advances and if the PA reforms to the satisfaction of the U.S. imperial overlords and if Donald Trump, the individual, decides that such a thing could proceed. Outrageously, the plan concluded with the U.S. arrogating to itself the role of the mediator with Donald Trump in charge and a kind of occupier for all future political settlements, which would guarantee many more horrific decades of Palestinian persecution in which they are forced to negotiate, to beg for their rights with their oppressor and the oppressor's chief sponsor. Tellingly, Trump's 20 points contain not a single word about the genocide, about the apartheid, or about the root causes. No accountability for perpetrators, no redress for victims. And the plan promised not the de-radicalization of the regime perpetrating genocide, but rather the de-radicalization of the Palestinian victims of the genocide. It is directed at ensuring that the exterminated people of Gaza will pose no threat to Israel, not to ensuring that Israel will pose no further threat to the exterminated people of Gaza. No guarantees that the Israeli regime, the perpetrator of the genocide, the occupier of three Arab nations, and the author of serial aggression against a half a dozen neighboring countries and a spate of transnational terrorism attacks and assassinations would pose no threat. Palestinian security forces were to be vetted by this mechanism. There would be no such vetting of Israeli forces, the ranks of which are rife with perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. The roots of this plan in Trump's earlier threat to, quote, own Gaza and to, quote, create a Gaza Riviera are revealed in the text itself. Under Trump's plan, Gaza is to be ruled by a colonial body headed by Donald Trump himself, with another prominent place on the body held by disgraced politician Tony Blair. The body, in typical Trumpian style, was dubbed the Board of Peace. It would set the entire framework and handle all funding for the redevelopment of Gaza, positioning it to control all resources coming from Gulf and European donors with no oversight. The possibility of staggering levels of corruption is self-evident. The unchecked external control, extraction, and exploitation of Palestine's economic resources would be inevitable. And there is no mention of Israel's international legal obligations to provide compensation and reparations for the damage that is inflicted on Gaza. While the plan usurps Palestinian agency by controlling Palestinian resources and designating Palestinian leaders, it also purports to entirely exclude some Palestinians from their right to be involved in the governance of their own country. Well, reminiscent of the eight-nation invasion of China in 1900, the plan even proposes a multinational proxy occupation force led by Donald Trump, with the participation of some, quote, Arab and international partners, none of which have stepped forward, that would, quote, stabilize Gaza, impose internal security, secure the borders on behalf of Israel, and cage Palestinians for another generation, preventing them from rearming, from defending themselves against Israeli aggression. Trump's scheme even explicitly cited his 2020 peace plan and incorporates it by reference, as well as the terrible French-Saudi plan that I've just described, as a part of the basis for this process. And you may recall that the 2020 plan included further expansion of Israeli territory, the annexation of much of the West Bank, the renunciation of all Palestinian legal claims against Israel, the exclusion of Palestine from East Jerusalem, and the creation of an archipelago of Palestinian Bantustans surrounded by Israeli settlements, borders, and walls. What's more, in parts, the Trump plan itself was unlawful as a matter of international law. The conditioning of humanitarian aid, implicit threats of collective punishment, the explicit denial of Palestinian self-determination, restrictions on political rights, the requirement that Palestinians negotiate for their inalienable human rights with their oppressors, and the failure to seek accountability for Israeli crimes up to and including genocide are all breaches of the international legal obligations of all countries that would be involved in this exercise. The outright rejection of the plan by representatives of Palestinian civil society and resistance factions demonstrated the dignified steadfastness of Palestinian society in struggling for their freedom, even in the darkest of times. But the world did not follow suit. In a truly sinister and shocking development, on 17 November 2025, the UN went full colonial. More than 2 years into the genocide in Palestine, the Security Council finally acted. But rather than acting to enforce international law, to protect the victims and to hold the perpetrators accountable, it adopted Resolution 2803, endorsing Donald Trump's plan. A resolution that openly flouts key provisions of international law, that disempowers and further punishes the victims and rewards and empowers the perpetrators, that hands control of Gaza and the survivors of the genocide over to Donald Trump and the United States as co-perpetrators of the genocide, and provides for the participation of the Israeli regime, the other perpetrator of the genocide, in decision-making. Palestinians are to be granted no such participation in decisions on their own rights, their own governance, and their own lives. In adopting this horrific resolution, the Security Council, in effect, has become a mechanism of U.S. oppression, an instrument for the continued unlawful occupation of Palestine, and a complicit actor in Israel's genocide. not since the UN partitioned Palestine in 1947 against the will of the indigenous people, setting the stage for 80 years of Nakba, has the UN acted in such a baldly colonial and legally ultra vires way and trampled so recklessly on the rights of a people. So, in the vote in the Security Council, both Russia and China abstained, and not a single member of the Security Council had the courage, principle, or respect for international law to vote against what can only be seen as a U.S. colonial outrage, a ratification of genocide, and a flagrant abdication of UN Charter principles. The resolution implicitly rejects a series of recent findings by the International Court of Justice. It denies the Palestinian right to self-determination. It reinforces Israel regime impunity, even as the genocide continues. Despite the ICJ's finding that the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination on their land, the resolution strips that right away, empowering hostile foreign forces to control them. Despite the court's finding that Gaza, as well as the West Bank and East Jerusalem, are illegally occupied and that the occupation must end quickly and completely, the resolution extends the Israeli occupation, endorses the indefinite presence of Israel regime troops, and superimposes a second US-led occupation on top of it. And despite the court's finding that the Palestinians need not negotiate for their rights with their oppressor, the resolution nullifies those rights and assigns them to the discretion of the US and its Israeli and other partners. Even in the midst of the ongoing genocide perpetrated by an apartheid regime, nowhere in the resolution is there a single mention of the crimes of genocide, apartheid, colonization, or the thousands of Palestinians still held in Israeli torture and death camps, or the principles of accountability for perpetrators or redress for victims. Nor is Israel required to meet its legal obligations for compensation and reparations. And with that responsibility instead being handed over to international donors, international financial institutions, in what amounts to a multi-billion-dollar bailout of the Israeli regime as it is perpetrating genocide. In sum, the resolution guarantees full impunity for the Israeli regime and even advances its normalization. And at the same time, it imposes, with the Trump-headed Board of Peace, a colonial administration to control all services and aid, the movement of all people in and out of Gaza, the funding and reconstruction of Gaza, and any other tasks, in the language of the resolution, that may be required, giving full power to Donald Trump as an individual to control the lives and resources and future of the Palestinian people. Well, the Security Council has granted a veto over Palestinian self-determination to the US, to the Israeli regime as a co-perpetrator of the genocide. This is truly historic. This is truly a catastrophe in every sense of the word. The resolution does not even offer hope that the systematic deprivation of the Palestinian people in Gaza will end. It only underscores the importance of humanitarian aid, but does not mandate it. It sets up a proxy occupation force headed ultimately by Donald Trump himself, with all of the elements that we mentioned in violation of the rights of the Palestinian people. How did this happen? How could it be that the world went along with such a bizarre, absurd, unlawful, and cruel plan in violation of the rules of the UN, of international law, and of the Security Council itself? This is what I have called a perfect storm of complicity. The United States used threats and inducements in carrots and sticks, the most extreme that delegations in New York had ever seen, according to their own comments, using trade deals and tariffs, manipulating the Russian vote with deals around Ukraine, trade and tariff issues with the Chinese, threats that if it was not approved, that they would unleash the dogs of genocide on Gaza fully again. And then, of course, came the betrayal of the Palestinian Authority, which insisted with other Arab countries and members of the Security Council that it wanted the resolution to pass and that no one should vote against it. The Palestinian Authority did this. Egypt, another member there, the Gulf countries that were participating, that were working for security guarantees and weapons, Saudi trying to become a major non-NATO ally of the United States, the broader Arab group, all of them went along with this horrible atrocity so that China and Russia, who could have vetoed it, then said, how could we oppose a resolution that the Palestinian Authority and all the governments in the region were telling us we must support? So they only then abstained, allowing this atrocity to go forward. This is a truly dangerous precedent. The world is sleepwalking into an unprecedented period of global tyranny under pressure from a violent and lawless US government, the UN Security Council, the body at the top of the international system with largely unconstrained legislative and enforcement power, and not subject to judicial review or appeal, has gone rogue, acting ultra vires outside the legitimate powers granted to it by the UN Charter, adopting a resolution that contravenes both the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and the highest peremptory rules of international law, directly violating precisely the rights of the Palestinian people recently affirmed by the International Court of Justice, and perpetrating an act of complicity with the principal forces responsible for the occupation and genocide in Gaza, the US, and Israel. Needless to say, this resolution has been rejected by Palestinian civil society and almost all Palestinian political and resistance factions. And human rights defenders and international law experts around the globe have also rejected it. As a matter of international law, the occupation of Palestine is unlawful. The Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. They have a right to resist foreign occupation, colonial domination, and racist regimes like Israel. Not only does this resolution seek to deny these rights, but it goes even further and tries to buttress the illegal Israeli presence and to authorize its own mechanisms of foreign occupation and colonial domination. What's more, the Security Council had no legal right to adopt this resolution. It gets all of its powers from the UN Charter. It has no other powers. And the Charter as a treaty is a part of international law. It is not above international law. That means the Security Council is bound by the rules of international law, including and especially the highest so-called jus cogens and erga omnes rules, like self-determination and the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by force. Its blatant disregard for the findings of the court on these matters reveals the degree to which many of the terms of the resolution are in fact unlawful and ultra vires beyond the authority of the Council. As such, the ramifications of this rogue action by the Security Council will have implications far beyond Palestine. The UN Security Council, if unconstrained by international law, becomes a dangerous instrument of repression and injustice. This is precisely what we have witnessed in this case, as the Council ignored international law and turned the survivors of Gaza over to the co-perpetrators of the genocide. Well, that's not where the story ends. The US attempt to impose 19th century colonialism on the long-suffering Palestinian people, like the French-Saudi colonial scheme that came before it, is destined to failure. Indeed, it's already coming unraveled. Such schemes are fundamentally flawed from the outset because they seek to impose outcomes without legality and without legitimacy. They're not legal under international law, and they have no legitimacy because they exclude the agency of the Palestinian people. And they have no practical hope of success, given their near universal rejection both in Palestine and across the world. So the US may have been able to threaten and bribe enough states to pass the resolution in a UN vote, but securing sufficient donations and troops and other personnel to implement the resolution on the ground against the will of the Palestinian indigenous people will be another matter. And sustaining support for those committed to justice, human rights, the rule of law, sustaining support for the plan is beginning to unravel. And that means that for those committed to justice, human rights, and the rule of law, the task is clear. The terms of Resolution 2803 are an affront to human rights and international law, and they must be resisted and opposed at every stage. Members of the Security Council should move to revoke the resolution. And if they are unable or unwilling, the UN General Assembly should convene under Uniting for Peace to adopt measures to mitigate the dangers of the resolution. In this way, the General Assembly could reject 2803 as ultra vires and unlawful and call on all states to reject any cooperation with it. They could call on states to adopt comprehensive sanctions and a military embargo against the Israeli regime. Now, while the Assembly lacks the power to enforce sanctions, it can call sanctions. It can give them multilateral legitimacy. It can monitor them, report on them, and supplement them as required. It can reject the UN General Assembly credentials of Israel, as the General Assembly did in the case of apartheid South Africa. It could mandate an accountability mechanism, like a criminal tribunal, to address Israeli war crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, and genocide. It could reactivate the UN's long dormant anti apartheid mechanisms to address Israeli apartheid. It could mandate a multinational UN protection force to deploy to Gaza and ultimately to the West Bank, acting at the request of Palestine to protect civilians, open entry points via land, sea, and air, facilitate humanitarian aid, preserve evidence of Israeli crimes, and assist in recovery and reconstruction. All of these actions could be adopted by the UN General Assembly with a two-thirds majority, thereby circumventing the US veto in the Security Council. And as Palestine has requested intervention, no Chapter 7 action by the Security Council is needed to deploy a protection force, which means Palestine will retain full authority over when and for how long the mission was to deploy, obviating fears of yet another occupation force. Very importantly, as affirmed by the World Court, Israel would have no legal right to refuse, obstruct, or influence the mission. The court has affirmed that Israel has no such rights in the occupied territories. On the judicial front, the ICJ should be asked to issue an advisory opinion on the unlawful and ultra vires resolution 2803. Individual states should refuse to participate or cooperate in its implementation in any way. This plan must be opposed by people as well, in every capital, at every juncture. Governments must be pressed to end their complicity in Israeli abuses, U.S. excesses, and this atrocious colonial scheme. The Israeli regime, for its part, must be isolated. Efforts toward boycott, divestment, and sanctions must be redoubled. A military, fuel, and technology embargo must be imposed. Israeli perpetrators must face judicial prosecutions in every available tribunal. And the streets must echo with the righteous roar for Palestinian freedom of millions through demonstrations and strikes and civil disobedience and direct action. And when the colonial house of cards falls, another, more just solution must be ready to take its place. If the global majority will rise from its knees before the emperor and assert its collective power acting under Uniting for Peace, circumvent the US veto, adopt accountability measures, isolate and punish the Israeli regime, and deploy real protection to Palestine, then the UN, international law, and the international system may live to fight another day. In this way, states could end their complicity in the gross violations of international law and in the application of 19th century colonialism in the 21st century. If not, the UN will almost certainly wither and die, a victim of self-inflicted wounds, none deeper than the shameful resolution of 17 November 2025. I think I'll stop there and we can leave the rest for our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I am sure a lot of us will be watching this a second time to pull it apart and go deeper in our own thoughts because there's so much there. Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, so we'll get into them. I mentioned this question earlier. We did post your resignation letter, and that does spell out many points that you just iterated on how we can start to turn the ship around, as it were. Please do, everybody, read the resignation letter because I think that will help bolster what Craig was just speaking about. In the letter, you mention an online impunity network. And who is that network?
You know, one of the developments of the course of the last 30 years, but the last 20 years or so in particular, has been that the Israel regime has established a network of harassment mechanisms all around the world. People will be familiar with these, organizations that are set up to target particular groups, to harass them, to smear them, to slander them, to get them in trouble in universities, to get them fired from their jobs, to get them canceled, and so on, all in the name of Israeli impunity. So anyone who has spoken out against Israeli violations will be familiar with this network, which includes now an extensive online network of these harassment cells, these organizations, some of which are like entirely focused on the UN, for example, have been set up to try to intimidate and silence UN officials from speaking out against Israeli atrocities. Some of them are entirely focused on university campuses. Others are focused on particular governments and others on journalists and so on. And they use an online network that includes these various groups. There is, for example, a group called UN Watch, which is one of the most abusive of these mechanisms. Another one called UK Lawyers for Israel. We have several in the United States, some of which perfidiously try to pose as Jewish organizations, but they're not Jewish organizations. They're in fact Israel regime proxies that work to try to silence any critique of the regime. And they have a very tried and true methodology that they will first attack an individual and try to smear and slander them. And then they will file a complaint against that individual. And then, having filed a complaint in whatever university or UN agency or government office, whatever it is, they will then go public with the story that that person is being investigated for anti-Semitism or anti-Israel bias or whatever is going to be, pro-terrorism, the usual lines and so on. So you get it. They will file a complaint, and having filed a complaint, they will then use that to say that that person is under investigation to try to create a sense that indeed there's a question as to whether or not this person is an anti-Semite or a supporter of terrorism, whatever the case may be. And then they send it out to their online network.
Yeah.
And they've set up their own sort of quasi-media spaces that can then echo it. And it will be echoed and bounced around. They will use their connections in governments in the West, in the German government, the British government, especially in the US government, tends to be, extremely right-wing members of Congress and so on who will facilitate these sorts of things, to repeat these sort of smears on the record. And then the hope is that as it bounces around, that a larger media corporation, usually Fox News might be the first to pick it up, and some others. Now you can bet CBS will play the same role, having been purchased by pro-Israel billionaires and so on. And in doing so, they do two things. One is they make life hell for the person who dared to speak out against Israeli atrocities, and they're spending all their time trying to defend themselves, and they can't do their work and trying to advance accountability. The other thing is it intimidates those institutions
Yeah.
who, rather than have to deal with, the flack that they're getting from these bodies that, by the way, will also mobilize their donors to universities and so on to bring additional pressure. They will simply sacrifice the innocent person who dared to speak out for human rights. And little by little, it creates a climate of fear in institutions that reduces the scrutiny and the principled positioning of organizations because they are afraid. And by the way, this goes all the way up to the Secretary General of the UN and other senior officials in the UN. I've witnessed it myself over time. So this kind of online network needs to be never bowed to. If you are attacked, speak louder, use solidarity, mobilize, expose these groups, hold them accountable, turn the tables, and use whatever means are available to try to shut down what are in the end proxy groups for Israeli impunity.
I think some of the comedians that we have here in this country have been the most vociferous in standing up to these kinds of tactics to suppress them. They refuse to be suppressed, and they're to be listened to. We can name them. So I think also I read an article where some of these universities, including unfortunately our university, Minnesota, um, are starting to take a look at the initial actions, knee-jerk, fearful reactions to Trump's threats of suing and yada yada. That's starting to flip-flop a little bit. I think you mentioned public outcry. Public outcry does work. It just has to increase many,
Yes.
many, many fold. Well, we'll get to the next question because otherwise we won't have time for any of them. What might have been done differently in 47 and 48, given the need to secure the safety of migrating European Jews fleeing horrific circumstances? What do you imagine might have been established that would respect the rights and security of all the people?
Well, the sort of revisionist history that has happened since the Second World War has erased the reality that most Jews, including most Jewish refugees who had suffered through the Holocaust and survived, were not interested in going to Palestine and taking the land away from the indigenous people. Most wanted to have safe and dignified lives where they chose to live, where it was their home, where their languages were spoken, where their history was. And so what, ask when here's rule number one. When you're talking about Palestine, apply the same norms and principles that you would apply to any other situation. So we had the genocide of European Jews perpetrated by other Europeans during the Second World War. What were they entitled to? They were entitled to redress. They were entitled to guarantees of non-recurrence. They were entitled to restoration of anything that they had lost. They were entitled to compensation. They were entitled to full civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights wherever they chose to live. The idea that you would create, a small territory somewhere and you would put all Jewish people there was an idea that was only supported by two groups. One were a tiny group of political Zionists amongst some Jewish thinkers in Europe, some very privileged Jewish thinkers in Europe.
And
Um,
Craig, you just froze. Can you repeat those two organizations?
Organizations. No,
Well,
I was
you
saying
said
that
two factions.
right. Right. So on the one hand, you had a very small minority group of privileged Jewish thinkers in Europe who were trying to push this idea of Zionism. You had Christian Zionists who had been, trying to develop this idea over many decades, beginning in the 19th century in particular, because of a kind of radical idea of end times and so on. And you had the anti-Semites of Europe who loved the idea of getting rid of their Jewish neighbors and sending them off over there with the brown people so we don't have to look at them anymore. Those were the constituencies that supported the idea of sending people to Palestine. And remember, the Zionist plan took place long before the Holocaust did. This wasn't something that was done in reaction to, to the Holocaust. It was an idea that was born in the same cauldron that developed other forms of colonialism and white supremacy and transatlantic slavery and fascism and Nazism. These kinds of supremacist ideas were all cooked in the same European cauldron. And a sister ideology of that is political Zionism. So what should have happened is that the perpetrators should have been held accountable. Some were, some weren't. Some were rewarded and given sanctuary in the West. It's interesting that the moment when, shiploads of Jewish refugees were being turned away from American shores, for example, defecting Nazis were welcomed in because of their scientific knowledge or other sorts of factors. So they should have been compensated, been given redress. Perpetrators should have been held accountable, and they should have been guaranteed their human rights in the places from which they came and in which they desired to live. That didn't happen because of this convergence of factors. And by the way, the people who didn't get a vote were the indigenous people of Palestine. The people who didn't get a vote were the Jewish communities of Western Asia and North Africa.
Yep,
So
yep.
that's what should happen. When there is genocide, when there is persecution, the answer is accountability for perpetrators, redress for victims, empowerment of survivors, and guarantees of non-repetition. That's what the Palestinians are entitled to now. It's what the Jews of Europe were entitled to after the Holocaust. Unfortunately, not that much has changed. If you listen to the German government now, they've only changed the names. So their vitriol is no longer directed at Jews. It's directed at Muslims, at Arabs, especially at Palestinians. And once again, the Germans, who seem to have never historically met a genocide they didn't like, has been an enthusiastic supporter of the genocide of the Palestinian people, just as they perpetrated genocide in Namibia and in Europe before.
Well, yes, and certainly the reality is that World War II did not eliminate true anti-Semitism, and I want to distinguish that between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Well, the Nazis are alive and well, and they're
Yes,
marching in our streets. Yeah.
absolutely, all over Europe and here. Next question is a question of clarification. What is the difference between the ICJ and the ICC?
The International Court of Justice is the highest court of the United Nations system. It was established with the UN in 1945. It is a court in which countries, states, bring each other to court, and which also can resolve questions of international law. So it's not something that individuals interact with. And that's where the genocide case against the state of Israel is proceeding. The International Criminal Court is a court of individual criminal accountability, where individuals are indicted and prosecuted for certain crimes. That's where Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted for crimes against humanity.
And
For
Milosevic and those
Milosevic and
characters.
others, yeah. And it is a court that is being attacked by the US government, which, because it dared to stand up to Israeli perpetrators, it is sanctioning, it is giving legal sanctions against the judges and prosecutors of the International Criminal Court, which is an absolutely lawless action, a violation of international law. But unfortunately, we are living in a country that has a rogue government that is wreaking havoc in violation of international law from the Caribbean to Western Asia and lots of places in between.
Thank you. I'm perusing some of these. Um, Well, I kind of had a similar question that I threw in, so I'm going to throw mine in with this one. How can we identify AIPAC candidates? And I presume that means for Congress and president, et cetera. And then I asked, are there any potential presidential candidates that might address this issue in a just manner instead of a political manner?
Well, there are some useful tools out there like AIPAC Tracker, which will give you the details of any politician who is accepting money from
Yeah.
AIPAC. And by the way, it's not just AIPAC. AIPAC has learned that their name is very toxic. There are a number of Israel lobby groups, some affiliated with AIPAC, some separate from AIPAC, that are causing the same harms to American policy and to lives around the world. I mean, I think for all of us, one way we exercise power is we refuse to vote for any politician who accepts AIPAC money, who refuses to condemn the genocide in Palestine, who insists on arming the Israeli regime. I mean, that's one power that we have. And you will be attacked for refusing to vote for those candidates, because the problem in the United States is both the Republican and the Democratic Party are as captured as you can be by Israeli interests, some because they're ideologically aligned, other because they're taking money, others, who knows, in the age of Epstein, what it is that is motivating them. But, take, for example, the visits of Benjamin Netanyahu to Washington. Remember, Netanyahu is an indicted fugitive from justice who is despised all around the globe for his notorious conduct. And yet he comes to Congress repeatedly, where both sides of the aisle stand up and cheer him in record standing ovations that no other visitor to the Congress has ever enjoyed. And those are Republicans and Democrats doing that. And they're not doing it because they think he's a good guy. They're doing it because they are captured. So if you are voting for a politician who refuses to renounce Israel lobby money, by the way, for other issues that you care about, if they are in the pocket of the military-industrial complex or the pharmaceutical lobbies or any of these other destructive entities, and you're voting for them, you're voting against your own interests, your own values. We have to refuse to do it. We have two parties that are captured by the Israeli project, and they don't represent us. I personally am a third party guy. I support the Green Party because I vote my values. When I participate politically, it's very personal for me. I will never be a part of a mandate given to somebody who is going to support genocide in Palestine or other or crimes here domestically in the U.S. or the denial of human rights anywhere. So they're easy to identify with tools like AIPAC Tracker, but look out, because There are a lot of pacts that have been established by AIPAC and their allies that even wage campaigns where they never talk about the Middle East. They'll talk about other issues, but their whole purpose is to defeat a candidate who doesn't toe the line in terms of Israeli control. So, yeah, very, very important question, I think.
I read many years ago in the 90s that there are dozens of lobbies that are hidden but are APAC focused.
Yeah. Even more now, even
Yep,
many, many more now.
no doubt, no doubt.
Lobbies and
Uh,
pacts.
we're getting a little short on time. I think we have time for at least one more question. Um, how close would the General Assembly be to reach that two-thirds needed that would be needed to override the Security Council?
Well, when this campaign was happening just a year or two ago, there was a clear two-thirds majority. All of the votes of this nature, including the historic vote in 2024, in September of 2024, had more than required two-thirds majority. All of most of the global South and some other countries that took principled positions um, you know, and voting on Palestine traditionally has been that way. There are votes where the only ones who vote against are the U.S., Israel, and a few Pacific dependencies of the United States, like Micronesia and so on. So the numbers are possible. The problem is that the strategy of distraction that I spoke about in my remarks, first with the French Saudi proposal and then with the Trump plan, has sort of shifted everybody's focus. And the terrifying thing about the moment in history in which we're living is the degree of complicity across governments and regions. It's not just the Western Europe group that is problematic here. It is countries across the global South that have been in one way or another been captured or co-opted through aid or trade or tech deals or very often weapons deals with the Israelis, or intimidated by the United States on behalf of the Israelis so that they won't take the principled position that we were used to seeing them take in the 60s and 70s and beyond. And that includes almost all of the governments of Western Asia, or the so-called Middle East, right? That includes, with the exception, the only remaining resistance to the U.S.-Israel project in what is the Middle East are Iran, and you see what's happening to Iran as a result. Half of Lebanon, which is to say the Hezbollah side of Lebanon, and half of Yemen, which is to say the Ansar Allah side of Lebanon. Every other country has become either captured or crushed for its resistance to the U.S.-Israel project in the region. So we saw what happened to Libya, we saw what happened to Iraq, we saw what happened to Syria, and we saw what they're trying to do now to Iran and to Yemen. And then we see the other governments of the region that sadly have simply aligned themselves for their own purposes and against the wishes of their own people with the U.S.-Israel project in the region. That's what we have to really push against strongly. So yes, it's still possible that you could get the two-thirds majority. What we need is a mobilization, as I said, from people to press their governments and their capitals to take the right position. And we need to get this move in the General Assembly, somebody to sponsor it. When Gustavo Petro of Colombia tried to do this last year, as I said, he was attacked, pushed back on, threatened even with invasion after Venezuela. And so we need, and you see how they're picking countries off one by. We see what's happening now with Cuba and so on. So we need to get that groundswell again going amongst publics, and then we need to get states. We need to get a group of states, beginning, I think, with the Hague group of states, which is this small grouping of states that have signed up to oppose what the Israeli regime is doing, to oppose the genocide, and to use whatever power they have by closing their ports to these activities, by using trade and economic mechanisms and so on. That needs to be built upon to get to that two-thirds majority. Yes, I still think it's possible. And the reason I think it's possible is because the distraction strategy, first, the French-Saudi proposal has been so discredited and pushed into the background. And now the Trump plan is already starting to come unraveled. He's not getting countries to enlist to participate in his proxy occupation force or his extension of the persecution of the Palestinians on behalf of the Israeli regime. So as it comes unraveled, we need to, as I said, we need to have something ready in its place to go. And so building that movement for this action in the General Assembly is, I think, at this moment, our best hope. It may fail, but we have to try. And by the way, if it fails, it's not just the countries in the gun sites that are going down, but the United Nations, international law, the international post-war system is going to go with it.
Absolutely. Um, I apologize that I could not get to all the questions. There were several, but in reading the questions, several of them were answered by you, Craig, in your presentation. So if you missed that, I encourage everybody to rewatch the recording when it becomes available. And I will close with a comment. Um, you keep emphasizing public outcry and protest, and there's no better example of how protest can change something than right here in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Here, here.
Enough said.
Absolutely. And, people should remember, and, we've all been inspired by what's been happening in Minnesota.
It's been
Truly, it's a glimmer of light in a very dark moment in history. But people should remember that, in the 1980s, the U.S. government and many in the West supported the apartheid regime in South Africa right up until the end of the 1980s.
yeah,
It was groups like MEPN, it was churches and labor unions and mosques and synagogues and ordinary people and human rights defenders and peace activists and community groups that changed the policy of governments across the West, ultimately even the government of the US, so that the impunity of the South African regime could no longer be maintained, and the resistance and the solidarity movements changed history as a result of that. That's our job in this case as well. And so grateful that there are groups like yours that are out there doing their part. It's so nice to be in dialogue with you.
and people like you speaking. And we thank you for accepting our invitation to speak today.